My name is Claire Whitman. I'm in my late 30s, a mother, a professional, and, at least on paper, someone most people would describe as steady. I've always been the calm one in the room, the woman who listens more than she speaks, the one who remembers birthdays, keeps receipts, shows up early, and doesn't make a spectacle of herself. People tend to underestimate me because of that. They mistake quiet for passivity, reflection for hesitation. They assume that because I don't raise my voice, I don't have one. And for a long time, I let them think that was true. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about winning. And it's definitely not about being the loudest or the angriest person in the room. It's about something far less cinematic, but far more real. What happens when accountability finally arrives, and it doesn't come gently. I'm telling this story now because, for a long time, I was positioned as the problem in a situation I did not create. When my marriage began to fracture, I was told I was too cold, too busy, too focused on details. When the affair surfaced, it was reframed as a reaction to me. And later, during a custody hearing that should have centered on our child's well-being, my husband tried to blame me for his betrayal, openly, confidently, and without shame. What you're about to hear is not a blow-by-blow of courtroom drama. There are no shouting matches here, no viral moments, no sudden triumphs. Instead, this is a quiet, chronological account of how small dismissals accumulate, how silence can be mistaken for weakness, and how preparation, done patiently and ethically, can change the outcome of everything. You'll hear about the version of me that others found useful, reliable, forgiving, invisible. You'll hear about the moment that version stopped being enough. And you'll hear how accountability doesn't always announce itself with anger. Sometimes it arrives as consequences that simply cannot be undone. I'm sharing this with honesty, not to humiliate anyone, but to tell the truth as cleanly as I can. Because there are so many people, especially women, who are taught to stay agreeable, to absorb blame, to keep the peace, even when the peace costs them their dignity. If you're listening to this, maybe you've been there too. Maybe you've been calm while others were careless. Maybe you've been blamed for someone else's choices. And maybe you've wondered what it would look like to stop explaining yourself and start standing still in the truth. So before we go any further, I want to ask you something gently and without judgment. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought you would never hold them accountable? For most of my adult life, I was defined less by who I was and more by how useful I could be to other people. To my husband, I was the organizer, the one who remembered deadlines, scheduled appointments, and kept the household functioning without reminders. I handled the school forms, the insurance renewals, and the emergency contacts. When something went wrong, I was expected to fix it quietly, efficiently, and without complaint. To his family, I was low maintenance. That was meant as a compliment. I didn't argue. I didn't demand attention. I didn't need reassurance. I smiled at dinner, helped clear plates, and excused myself early when our child got tired. I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't emotional. I was easy. At work, I was dependable. The person managers trusted with sensitive projects because I didn't gossip. I didn't posture. I didn't need credit. If something failed, I absorbed the pressure. If something succeeded, I stepped back. I was often described as solid, which is another word for invisible. And invisibility, I learned, makes people comfortable. When you don't take up much space, others start to assume you don't need any. They speak over you without noticing. They decide things on your behalf. They narrate your intentions for you. Not maliciously, always, but confidently. I was the woman to whom people explained things that I already understood. The wife people assumed would handle it. The mother people expected to be endlessly patient, endlessly flexible, endlessly forgiving. I didn't resent this at first. I thought it meant I was mature. I thought restraint was a virtue that would be rewarded. I believed that if I stayed reasonable, calm, and fair, I would be met with the same. What I didn't understand yet was that calmness, when it's one-sided, becomes a blank canvas. And other people will paint whatever story suits them best. In my marriage, that story slowly became this. I was distant. I was emotionally unavailable. I was hard to reach. These descriptions didn't come from fights or confrontations. They appeared casually, almost academically, usually after I'd done something competent but unsentimental, like asking about finances or questioning a vague explanation or declining to argue. You don't react, my husband once said, half laughing, half accusing. It's like you're not even affected. What he meant was that I didn't perform distress on cue. I didn't cry easily. I didn't beg. I didn't escalate. I processed things internally and responded when I was ready. And instead of that being seen as a strength, it was reframed as an absence. To others, I was the wife who let things slide, the woman who didn't push back, the one who would understand. No one asked if understanding was costing me something. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being consistently underestimated, not because you're weak, but because you're composed. People assume that if you're not visibly struggling, you must not be struggling at all. They forget that silence can be full, that stillness can be deliberate. I was present for everything that mattered. I showed up. I followed through. I held our family together in ways that weren't romantic or dramatic, but essential. And because it looked effortless, it was taken for granted. I became a background figure in my own life. When disagreements arose, they were framed as misunderstandings I should resolve. When emotional distance grew, it was attributed to my personality. When responsibility needed to be assigned, it drifted quietly in my direction, and I accepted it, at least outwardly. Not because I believed it, but because pushing back felt unnecessary. At the time, I thought clarity would eventually speak for itself. If I stayed consistent, the truth would surface naturally. I didn't yet understand that truth doesn't surface on its own in systems that benefit from ignoring it. Looking back, this was the version of me everyone preferred: capable, calm, and silent. A woman who made life easier for others by making herself smaller. A presence so reliable that it faded into the structure of things, noticed as only when threatened with absence. That was who I was to them. Not because it was all I was, but because it was all they bothered to see. The first time something felt wrong, it was so small that I almost dismissed it myself. There was no argument, no raised voice, no obvious betrayal, just a sentence, delivered casually, in a tone that suggested it didn't matter enough to remember. We were getting ready for a small dinner at a friend's house. Nothing formal, just people we'd known for years. I asked my husband if he'd told them we might arrive late because I had a work call that ran over. He didn't look up from his phone when he answered. I told them you're usually slow anyway. He smiled when he said it, like it was a harmless joke, like it was a familiar truth everyone would agree with. The room went quiet inside me, not because the comment was cruel, but because it rewrote reality. I wasn't slow. I was precise. I planned transitions carefully so things didn't fall apart. But the way he said it made it sound like a flaw, an inconvenience he'd generously learned to tolerate. I didn't correct him, I noted it. That's something people misunderstand about quiet people. They assume silence means confusion or acceptance. Often, it means documentation. I watched how easily that sentence slid into place, how comfortable he was defining me without checking if it was accurate, how unchallenged it felt to him. It. At dinner, the comment resurfaced, this time in front of others. She's the reason we're late, he said lightly as we sat down. She takes forever. Everyone laughed, not unkindly, not maliciously, just the polite laughter that smooths over discomfort. I smiled too, reflexively. No one asked me if it was true. No one wondered why he felt so free to frame me that way. It was easier to accept the shorthand version of me than to complicate the moment. That was the cut. Not the words themselves, but the way they were received without question. Later that night, I replayed it in my head, trying to determine if I was being too sensitive. That's what women like me are trained to do. Audit our reactions before we audit the behavior that caused them. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't insulted me directly. He'd just edited me, reduced me to a punchline that made him look relaxed and reasonable. I told myself it didn't matter, but once I noticed it, I started noticing similar moments everywhere. Small corrections to my story, casual reinterpretations of my intentions, comments framed as jokes that always moved responsibility away from him and toward me. If he forgot something, it was because I hadn't reminded him. If he was stressed, it was because I was hard to read. If he was unhappy, it was because I was emotionally distant. None of this was said in anger. That's what made it dangerous. It was said with certainty, and certainty, repeated often enough, starts to sound like a fact. I mentioned the dinner comment to him a few days later, not accusingly, just neutrally. It felt a little unfair, I said. I wasn't slow. I had work. He shrugged. You know I didn't mean anything by it. You're always so serious about words. That was the second cut, because now the issue wasn't what he'd said. It was my reaction to it. My awareness became the problem. My clarity was reframed as overanalysis. I learned something important in that moment. Accountability can be deflected simply by minimizing the harm. No apology followed, no acknowledgement, just a subtle suggestion that I should loosen up, that I should be easier. And because I didn't escalate, the moment passed, but it didn't disappear. It settled, quietly. I didn't confront him again about it. Not because I forgot, but because I was watching. I wanted to understand if this was an anomaly or a pattern. That's the thing about the first small cut. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't stop you from functioning. It doesn't demand immediate attention. But it teaches you where the blade is. And once you know that, you start paying very close attention to who keeps holding it and who keeps pretending it's not there at all. Once the first cut is made, the rest don't need to be sharp. They just need to be frequent. What followed wasn't a dramatic shift in my marriage. There was no single moment where I could point and say, this is where everything changed. Instead, there was a slow recalibration, one that trained everyone involved, including me, to accept a slightly distorted version of reality. Disrespect, when delivered softly and consistently, begins to feel like background noise. It showed up in conversations that ended before I finished my sentence, in decisions that were already handled without my input. In stories told to friends, they conveniently left out my contribution or reframed it as support rather than leadership. If I corrected him, even gently, it was met with amusement. You're being defensive, he'd say. I was just joking. You always assume the worst. Each response carried the same underlying message. The problem wasn't what he'd done, it was that I noticed. Over time, I found myself anticipating that reaction, editing my words before speaking, letting things go, because explaining them would take energy I wasn't sure I had. That's how normalization works, not through force, but through fatigue. I became the reasonable one, the understanding one, the one who didn't make a big deal out of small things. And because I was capable of carrying that role, it slowly became expected. Friends would comment on how calm I was compared to him. You balance him out, someone once said, smiling. He's passionate, you're steady. What they didn't see was that the balance had started to feel like erosion. I was absorbing the impact so he didn't have to. When he grew distant, it was explained as stress. When he missed family events, it was work pressure. When he became critical, it was framed as honesty. And I accepted these explanations because they were plausible, because challenging them would require proof I didn't yet have, because part of me still believed that good faith would be reciprocated. I told myself stories that made staying easier. He doesn't mean it. He's just overwhelmed. This phase will pass. What I didn't tell myself, at least not out loud, was that I was shrinking, not in personality, in permission. I was giving myself less and less permission to be bothered, to ask for clarity, to expect respect without negotiation. There's a particular moment I remember clearly. We were with a group of parents after a school event. Someone asked how we managed our schedules with a child and two demanding jobs. Before I could answer, my husband spoke. She handles all that, he said. I'd be lost without her. It sounded like praise. Everyone smiled. Someone said I was lucky he appreciated me. But what he'd actually done was finalize a narrative. I was the administrator of his life, the infrastructure, not a partner, an operator. I smiled and nodded, because correcting him would have felt awkward, because it was easier to accept the compliment than to unpack the imbalance behind it. Later, I realized how often I did that, accepting a partial truth because challenging it would expose a larger one. At home, the pattern continued. If I asked for emotional presence, I was adding pressure. If I asked for the transparency, I was interrogating. If I withdrew to think, I was cold. Each response trained me further. Not overtly, but effectively. So I adapted. I spoke less. I observed more. I stopped explaining myself to people who weren't listening. I focused on our child, on work, on maintaining stability. From the outside, it probably looked like maturity, like patience, like strength. And in some ways, it was. But it was also a postponement. I was postponing the conversation I wasn't ready to have, postponing the realization I hadn't yet named. Disrespect had become normal, not because I believed it was acceptable, but because confronting it required certainty. And certainty requires evidence, not just feeling. So I waited, not passively, intentionally. I watched what happened when I didn't step in. I noticed how quickly blame shifted when something went wrong. I paid attention to who benefited from my silence. And slowly, without announcing it, something inside me stopped trying to be understood. That was the quietest change of all. Because when you stop trying to be understood by someone, it's not apathy. It's preparation. By the time I understood the role I'd been assigned, I had already been playing it for years. Not because I agreed to it, but because I performed it well. I was the stabilizer, the translator, the one who smoothed edges and absorbed friction so everything else could keep moving. When tensions rose, people looked to me, not to speak, but to contain, to make things easier, to reduce discomfort. In my marriage, that role was unspoken but firmly established. I was expected to be reasonable no matter the circumstances, to respond calmly even when information was withheld, to accommodate changes I hadn't agreed to prioritize harmony over clarity. If I expressed frustration, it was treated as an anomaly, something out of character that needed explanation. If he expressed frustration, it was treated as a signal that something external needed to change. The difference was subtle, but consistent. Over time, I noticed that accountability flowed in only one direction. When things went well, it was because we were a great team. When things went poorly, it was because I was hard to connect with. That framing did something dangerous. It made my presence conditional. I wasn't valued for who I was. I was valued for how effectively I managed other people's emotions. Even our child began to reflect it in small ways. Mom will handle it, my husband would say. Ask your mom, teachers were told. Your mom's better at that, relatives assumed. I became the default, not because I demanded control, but because I accepted responsibility. And the more responsibility I carried, the more invisible it became. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being competent in silence, from knowing that if you step back, things will fall apart, and being blamed if they do. That exhaustion didn't make me angry. It made me efficient. I stopped expecting reciprocity. I stopped asking for emotional labor in return. I compartmentalized my needs because acknowledging them felt disruptive. At some point, without discussion, I became the emotional firewall. My husband would vent to me about work, about stress, about disappointment. I listened. I validated. I made space. But when I needed space, it was interpreted as distance. When I needed reassurance, it was seen as criticism. I learned to self-soothe, to resolve things internally, to arrive at conversations already composed so they wouldn't derail. And the more composed I became, the less anyone thought to check on me. I didn't see myself as a victim. I still don't. What I see now is a woman who was quietly overfunctioning in a system that rewarded her for it. The role wasn't enforced through cruelty, it was reinforced through convenience. Everyone benefited from me staying exactly where I was. And that's the part that took me the longest to accept. People don't always assign you a role because they're malicious. Sometimes they do it because you're capable and because it costs them nothing. I remember standing in the kitchen one night loading the dishwasher after everyone had gone to bed. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles when all obligations are momentarily paused. I realized then that no one had asked me how I was in weeks. Not because they didn't care, but because they assumed I was fine. I had trained them too. That realization didn't hurt in the way betrayal hurts. It felt cleaner than that, almost surgical, because it clarified something essential. If I continued in this role, nothing would change. Not because people were cruel, but because systems don't correct themselves when they're functioning as designed. I had been designed for reliability, into patience, into invisibility. And once you see the design clearly, you have two options. You can continue to perform the role perfectly and disappear further into it, or you can stop playing it, knowing full well that the absence will be noticed long before the effort ever was. That night, I didn't make a decision. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a boundary. I simply acknowledged the truth to myself, and that was enough to begin loosening the role, quietly, carefully, and without permission. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no discovery, no confrontation that forced clarity into the open. In fact, if you were watching from the outside, you would have missed it entirely. It was an ordinary weekday morning. Our child was at school. My husband had already left for work. The house was quiet in the way it only ever was when I was alone in it, temporarily unneeded, temporarily unobserved. I was standing at the kitchen counter sorting mail, utility bills, school flyers, a bank statement that hadn't been opened yet. I remember hesitating before opening it, not because I expected anything specific, but because I'd grown accustomed to handling finances reactively rather than proactively. He managed most of it, or at least that's what the arrangement had slowly become. I trusted him, or more accurately, I didn't question him. The statement itself wasn't explosive, no obvious red flags, just a charge that didn't fit. Small, repeated, vaguely labeled. I stared at it longer than necessary, not alarmed, just attentive. I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't assume betrayal. I simply noticed. And then I noticed something else. My first instinct wasn't to ask him about it was to understand it. That was the shift. Not suspicion, but self-trust. For years, my reflex had been relational. Clarify together. Give the benefit of the doubt. Keep things smooth. But in that moment, I realized how often that instinct had overridden my own perception. How often I'd deferred clarity in the name of peace. I sat down with the statement and pulled out others from the drawer. I compared dates, amounts, patterns. Nothing definitive yet, just inconsistencies. But instead of brushing them aside, I felt something unfamiliar, calm resolve. Not fear, not anger, permission. I gave myself permission to look without apologizing for it. Permission to take my own questions seriously. Later that day, I went about my routine as usual. Work calls, emails, school pickup, dinner. I watched myself from a distance, noticing how little outwardly had changed and how fundamentally something inside had. I wasn't preparing for confrontation. I wasn't rehearsing accusations. I wasn't planning an exit. I was gathering information. And I realized with startling clarity that no one had ever told me I couldn't. That night, my husband talked about his day. I listened. I responded. I smiled at the right moments. But I noticed something else too. How easily he spoke when he assumed I wasn't tracking details. How confident was he in his version of events? That confidence no longer intimidated me. It informed me. I went to bed that night without resolving anything, without answers, without certainty. But I slept differently because something essential had changed. Not in the situation, but in my posture toward it. I stopped seeing myself as the stabilizer of everyone else's comfort. I started seeing myself as the steward of my own reality. Over the next few days, nothing escalated. No clues fell neatly into place. No dramatic revelations surfaced. But I paid attention to tone, to timing, to what was volunteered and what wasn't. I noticed how often decisions were presented to me as conclusions rather than conversations. How frequently I was looped in after the fact. And instead of correcting or challenging, I did something new. I stayed still. Silence, for the first time, wasn't avoidance. It was space. I used that space to think, not emotionally, but structurally. If something was wrong, I would need evidence. If accountability ever arrived, it would need clarity. If the truth was going to matter, it couldn't rely on my word alone. That realization didn't harden me, it grounded me. I understood then that waiting wasn't weakness, it was alignment. That restraint wasn't passivity, it was control. The shift wasn't about mistrust. It was about no longer outsourcing my sense of reality to someone else. I didn't know yet where this would lead. I didn't know what I would find, if anything. But I knew one thing with certainty. I was done ignoring my own questions. And once that happens, nothing ever really goes back to the way it was before. Once I stopped explaining myself internally, my silence changed shape. Before, it had been reactive, a way to avoid conflict, a pause while I searched for the most reasonable response. It was silence born of consideration, sometimes even self-doubt. Now it was intentional. I still didn't confront him. I still didn't ask questions out loud. But the difference was that I knew exactly why. I was no longer waiting for permission to be concerned. I was choosing not to reveal what I was observing. That choice gave me something I hadn't had in a long time: leverage. Not the aggressive kind, not the kind that threatens or manipulates, the quiet kind that comes from asymmetry. When one person knows more about the situation than the other realizes. At home, my behavior didn't change enough to raise suspicion. I kept routines steady, conversations polite, emotional temperature neutral. But internally, I was tracking everything. I noted when his schedule shifted without explanation. When meetings ran later than usual, they were always on the same days. When his phone never left his sight, not protectively, but reflexively. None of this proved anything on its own. I knew that. What it proved was inconsistency. And inconsistency is where truth eventually surfaces. The most revealing moments weren't the obvious ones. They were the casual ones. The way he'd answer questions quickly before thinking. The way certain names appeared and disappeared from conversation. The way he became defensive was only when I asked neutral, logistical things. So I stopped asking. Silence, I learned, creates a vacuum, and people tend to fill it, often with more than they intend. When I didn't prompt him, he volunteered explanations. When I didn't react, he over-explained. When I didn't push back, he filled the space with narratives that contradicted themselves over time. I listened. At the same time, I began to reclaim small pieces of autonomy. I reviewed shared documents. I organized files. I downloaded copies of things I'd previously trusted would always be accessible, not out of paranoia, but prudence. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't justify it to myself or anyone else. I treated it like maintenance, the same way you prepare for winter before the storm arrives. What surprised me most during this period was how invisible my silence remained. No one checked in to ask if something was wrong. No one noticed I was quieter, not because I'd become withdrawn, but because quiet was already my default. That invisibility, which had once felt like a weakness, now protected me. It gave me time to think, time to notice patterns, time to understand the structure of the situation without being pressured to respond emotionally. And in that time, something else became clear. I wasn't angry. That absence of anger mattered. Anger rushes you. It demands release. It wants a resolution now. What I felt instead was clarity, a sense that whatever was unfolding didn't require confrontation. It required comprehension. I wasn't interested in catching him in a lie. I was interested in understanding the system that allowed lies to exist comfortably. Because systems reveal more than moments ever do. I saw how often he positioned himself as misunderstood, how easily blame shifted outward, how rarely responsibility settled where it belonged. And I realized that if the truth ever came into the open, it would likely be framed the same way. That realization didn't scare me. It prepared me. Silence became my way of not tipping the balance prematurely, not forcing a reaction before I understood the full picture. It wasn't strategic in the cinematic sense. I wasn't plotting an outcome. I was preserving optionality. I wanted to be able to choose my response when the time came, not be cornered into one by emotion, pressure, or incomplete information. There's a particular strength in restraint that only becomes visible in hindsight. At the time, it just looks like nothing is happening, but something was happening. I was stepping out of the role I'd been assigned, not loudly, not defiantly, but decisively. I was no longer participating in narratives that required my silence to survive. I was using silence to watch them unravel on their own. What they never noticed was that I had always been observant. They mistook my calm for detachment, my lack of interruption for disengagement. They assumed that because I didn't assert myself loudly, I wasn't paying attention. That assumption created a blind spot, one I never asked for, but learned to use. Preparation didn't begin with discovery. It began with organization. I created a structure for information the same way I always had, for projects, for deadlines, for crises that required patience more than panic. I didn't label it evidence. I labeled it records, neutral, factual, boring, dates, times, transactions, changes, nothing dramatic, just reality preserved. I saved copies of bank statements, not just the unusual ones, calendars, not just the altered entries, messages that seemed harmless in isolation, but meaningful in sequence. I didn't rush. Rushing introduces bias. It tempts you to see what you're afraid of rather than what's there. Instead, I let patterns emerge, and they did. What struck me wasn't the presence of secrecy, it was the predictability of it. The same days, the same windows of time, the same explanations are recycled with minor variations. I noticed how often he relied on my assumptions to carry him forward. He assumed I wouldn't check. He assumed I wouldn't connect the details. He assumed I wouldn't prepare quietly. Those assumptions weren't insults. They were habits formed over years of my reliability, my restraint, my willingness to keep things smooth. In other words, he underestimated me, not because I was weak, but because I was consistent. At the same time, I educated myself, not obsessively, intentionally. I read about financial transparency in marriage, about custody proceedings, not because I anticipated one, but because I understood how narratives form when relationships collapse. I learned how responsibility is assigned in courtrooms that value composure over truth, confidence over accuracy. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this. Not friends, not family. Preparation, I realized, loses its power when it's announced. Externally, I remained the same. Internally, I was building context. I began to see how often I had been positioned as the emotional variable in our marriage, the one whose reactions were scrutinized, whose tone mattered more than content. That awareness changed how I documented things. I didn't write feelings. I wrote facts. Not that I felt dismissed, but the conversation ended at 9:14 p.m. after I asked for clarification. Not, he seemed distant, but did not return home until after midnight. Explanation differed from prior statement. Dry, precise, undeniable. What they never noticed was how comfortable I am with patience. I wasn't waiting for a confession. I wasn't hoping for a mistake. I was allowing the system to reveal itself fully. There's a misconception that preparation requires aggression, that strength must announce itself. But the most effective preparation often looks like compliance. I continued managing logistics, continued being polite, continued absorbing friction where necessary. And in doing so, I gave him no reason to change his behavior. People only become careful when they sense risk. He sensed none because I didn't threaten the status quo. I simply stopped protecting it. The deeper I went, the clearer something else became. This wasn't just about an affair, though the outline of one was beginning to take shape. It was about narrative control, about who would be believed if things came apart, about who had a history of emotional stability, about who appeared reactive and who appeared reasonable. I saw, with growing clarity, how easily blame could be redirected toward me if I wasn't careful, and I understood something essential. If accountability ever arrived, it wouldn't arrive because someone suddenly told the truth. It would arrive because the truth was already documented. That realization didn't make me cold. It made me fair. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't interpret. I didn't editorialize. I persevered. What they never noticed was that while they were assuming my silence meant acceptance, it actually meant completion. I wasn't frozen. I was finishing my understanding. And when understanding is complete, decisions stop feeling heavy. They become inevitable. By the time I was done preparing, I didn't feel vindictive or triumphant. I felt steady because whatever came next I would not be relying on anyone else to validate my reality. I had already done that work myself, quietly, completely, without warning. The reveal didn't happen all at once. There was no moment where everything snapped into focus with cinematic clarity. No single message, no undeniable photograph, no confession that rearranged my understanding in a single breath. Instead, there was convergence, separate lines of information, each unremarkable on its own, began to intersect. Dates aligned, explanations overlapped, absences coincided with transactions that no longer had plausible alternatives. What emerged wasn't shocking, it was confirming. And that distinction mattered more than I expected. I remember sitting at my desk late one evening, the house quiet again, the familiar black binder open in front of me. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't racing through pages. I was calm in the way people are when they already know the answer and are simply verifying it. There it was. Not an emotional truth, but a structural one. The pattern wasn't ambiguous anymore. The repetition was too consistent. The omissions are too deliberate. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a phase. It wasn't stressful. It was a sustained choice. That realization didn't hurt in the way people imagine betrayal hurts. There was no sudden grief, no disbelief. What I felt instead was distance, a clean, clarifying distance between what I had been told and what was true. And in that distance, something unexpected happened. I stopped taking it personally. I saw with almost academic clarity how long the groundwork had been laid, how gradually responsibility had been shifted away from him and toward me, how my calm had been used not just as contrast, but as cover. He hadn't needed me to be unaware. He had needed me to be predictable, and I had been, until I wasn't. I didn't confront him after the reveal. Not that night, not the next day. I closed the binder. I put it away. And I allowed myself to sit with the full understanding, not to rehearse what I would say, but to decide what mattered next. Because knowing the truth doesn't automatically tell you what to do with it. There were options. I could confront him privately and attempt repair. I could demand explanations. I could expose everything immediately. But each option came with consequences, not just for him, but for me, for our child, for the future structure of my life. For the first time, I wasn't thinking emotionally. I was thinking strategically, not about punishment, but about alignment. What outcome would allow me to remain grounded? What path would protect my child from chaos rather than create more of it? What version of myself did I want to carry forward? The answers didn't come as commands. They came as boundaries. I knew what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't beg for honesty from someone who had avoided it. I wouldn't argue with partial truths. I wouldn't collapse into confrontation that could be reframed as instability. Most importantly, I wouldn't reveal what I knew until it mattered. The private reveal gave me something invaluable: choice. For years, decisions had been presented to me as conclusions. Now I held the full context, and that changed everything. I watched him more carefully after that, not suspiciously, precisely. I noticed how comfortable he was lying by omission, how easily he justified inconsistencies to himself, how convinced he was that his version of events would be enough. I also noticed something else. He was preparing too, not in the way I was, but defensively. He began to frame conversations preemptively, to position himself as misunderstood, to hint at dissatisfaction without naming causes. At the time, I didn't fully understand why. Later, I would. But in that moment, I simply took note. The reveal didn't make me react. It made me patient in a new way. Because once you know the truth, urgency becomes optional. You no longer need immediate resolution. You need the right moment. And that moment, I understood, wouldn't be private. It would arrive in a space where facts mattered more than feelings, where narratives would be tested against records, where calm wouldn't be interpreted as absence but as credibility. So I waited, not passively, not fearfully, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had already seen the ending and was simply allowing the middle to unfold. The hardest decisions aren't the emotional ones, they're the irreversible ones. Once the truth was clear, I entered a period that looked, from the outside, like stillness. No confrontations, no visible change in routine, no ultimatums delivered in the heat of discovery. But internally, everything was narrowing. This was the decision point, not about whether I would act, but how. I laid out the options the way I do with any complex problem, without drama, without denial. Option one was confrontation. I could sit him down, present what I knew, demand honesty, and attempt to rebuild something on the premise of accountability. But I understood the risks of that path. Confrontation gives the other person time to prepare, to adjust their story, to shape the narrative, to frame the discovery as a reaction rather than a response. It would also require me to trust him again, not emotionally, but structurally. I wasn't willing to do that. Option two was immediate separation, clean, direct, decisive. But that option came with its own complications: emotional fallout, financial instability, and most importantly, the potential for conflict to spill into our children's lives before safeguards were in place. I wasn't prepared to introduce chaos in the name of speed. Option three was silence. Not indefinite silence, but delayed action. Action taken not from shock, but from preparedness. This option required patience. It required restraint. It required tolerating discomfort without reacting to it. It also preserved something crucial: control over timing. Timing, I realized, was everything. I wasn't interested in catching him off guard emotionally. I was interested in ensuring that when accountability arrived, it arrived with context: legal, factual, and undeniable. That meant thinking ahead. I consulted professionals, not dramatically, not urgently, quietly. I asked general questions. I learned how custody evaluations work, how financial disclosures are assessed, how patterns of behavior are weighed against claims of character. I didn't share details. I gathered frameworks. And in those frameworks, I saw something clearly. Emotional reactions are easy to discredit. Documentation is not. That clarity made the decision easier than I expected. I chose the path that aligned with my values. Not revenge, not exposure, but responsibility. Responsibility to my child, responsibility to my future self, responsibility to the truth. That meant waiting while continuing to document, waiting while maintaining normalcy, waiting while letting his assumptions carry him forward. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I wanted to speak, when the weight of knowing pressed hard against my composure, when silence felt like complicity. But I reminded myself of something important. Silence is only complicity if it protects harm. What I was doing protected clarity. I wasn't covering for him. I wasn't excusing behavior. I was ensuring that when the situation became public, because situations like this always do, it would not be defined by impulse. The irreversible choice wasn't to stay or to leave. It was to stop reacting and start directing. Once that choice was made, everything else fell into sequence. I organized my records. I separated my understanding from my emotions. I made contingency plans that I hoped I wouldn't need, but would be grateful to have. I also adjusted my expectations. I stopped hoping for remorse, stopped imagining explanations that would make things hurt less. I accepted something fundamental. Accountability rarely comes from confession. It comes from consequence, and consequences require structure. The decision point wasn't loud. There was no moment where I said, "This is it." There was just a quiet internal alignment, a sense that I was no longer drifting. I had chosen the irreversible path, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. And from that point forward, I no longer wondered what I would do. I simply prepared to do it well. Once the decision was made, everything I did looked the same on the surface. That was intentional. I continued our routines, school drop-offs, shared meals, weekend logistics, conversations that stayed safely on the edges of things. But underneath that familiarity, movement had begun. Quiet, methodical, and forward. I started by separating what needed to be separate. Mentally, first, then practically. I reviewed accounts not to accuse, but to understand exposure. I clarified what was joint, what was individual, what documentation existed, and what didn't. I made copies. I secured access. I ensured nothing essential depended on goodwill alone. At work, I increased my visibility, not loudly, but deliberately. I documented contributions. I clarified responsibilities. I ensured my professional identity stood on its own, independent of my personal life. That wasn't ambition, it was insulation. I arranged consultations during lunch hours. Under the guise of routine errands, I asked questions without revealing context. I learned timelines without committing to them. Information, I learned, doesn't pressure you. It steadies you. At home, I became even more neutral, not colder, not warmer. Predictable. Predictability disarms suspicion. He didn't notice the shift because it didn't disrupt his comfort. In fact, he seemed more relaxed, more confident. People rarely question stability when it benefits them. I watched as he grew more careless with details, more assured in explanations, more willing to pre-frame issues before they exist. I didn't interrupt. Moving in silence requires resisting the urge to correct the record prematurely, because correction alerts, and alerts change behavior. I needed the behavior unchanged. What surprised me most during this time was how calm I felt. Not numb, not detached. Clear. The anxiety I'd carried for years, the low-grade tension of managing everything, began to lift. In its place was focus. Each step I took had purpose. I wasn't improvising. I was sequencing. I also paid attention to how easily responsibility continued to flow toward me in conversations with others. "She's just better at handling things," he'd say. "She prefers to stay out of conflict." Those statements, once frustrating, now served a different function. They built a record of expectation, a pattern of reliance, a contrast that would matter later. I didn't argue with them. I let them stand. Silence again worked in my favor. At night, after the house was quiet, I reviewed my notes. Not obsessively, systematically. I checked for gaps. I ensured consistency. I asked myself hard questions. Was I being fair? Was I documenting objectively? Was I prepared for my own assumptions to be tested? I corrected myself when necessary, removed anything speculative, tightened language. This wasn't about winning, it was about integrity. Moving in silence also meant preparing emotionally. I rehearsed calm, not speeches. I practiced not reacting. I imagined scenarios where blame might be redirected toward me and noted where the facts would speak instead. I knew how easily a composed exterior could be misinterpreted as detachment or coldness. I prepared for that too. Clarity doesn't always look compassionate to people who rely on confusion. Through all of this, my husband remained unaware, not because he was unintelligent, but because he believed the story he'd been telling, that I would always smooth things over, that I wouldn't disrupt the structure, that if something was wrong, I would talk first. He didn't realize that talking had stopped being my primary tool. Movement had replaced it. By the time the first external consequence began to form, subtle, procedural, unavoidable, everything was already in place. From the outside, it would look sudden. To me, it felt overdue. Because accountability rarely arrives with noise. It arrives when silence has finished its work. Consequences don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive as small disruptions, barely noticeable at first, easy to dismiss as a coincidence or bad luck. That's how it began. A request for documentation he hadn't anticipated, a procedural delay that required explanation, a question from an external party that didn't align with the version of events he'd been rehearsing. None of it was dramatic. None of it looked like exposure, but it introduced friction. And friction reveals pressure points. I watched as his confidence shifted, not collapsed, but tightened. His explanations grew longer. His tone was more defensive, even when no accusation had been made. "What's this about?" he asked one evening, holding a letter he didn't fully understand. "Just routine," I said truthfully. "They need clarification." I didn't add anything else. The discomfort wasn't in the request. It was in the loss of control. For years, he'd operated on the assumption that information moved through him. He decided what was relevant, what was shared, and what was omitted. Now information was moving independently, and he could feel it. He began checking details more often, asking questions he'd never asked before, attempting to preempt outcomes with reassurance. "You know I've always been honest with you," he said once, casually over dinner. I nodded. Honesty, when asserted unprompted, is rarely about truth. The consequences continued to accumulate quietly. Nothing I did provoked them. Nothing I said accelerated them. They emerged from systems he hadn't designed, and therefore couldn't control. At the same time, I noticed how quickly his behavior shifted when pressure appeared, not toward accountability, but toward image management. He began to speak about stress more openly, to frame himself as overwhelmed, to suggest that misunderstandings might arise if people misinterpret his intentions. I didn't challenge any of it, because I understood something essential. People reveal their priorities when consequences begin, and his priority wasn't repair, it was positioning. Friends noticed before I did. "Is everything okay?" one asked gently. "He seems unsettled." I answered honestly but briefly. "We're handling things." That sentence had carried me through years of accommodation. Now it meant something else entirely. At home, the atmosphere shifted. not into conflict, but into vigilance. He paid closer attention to my reactions, searched for signs, tried to reestablish a sense of predictability. But predictability requires symmetry, and we no longer had that. I wasn't hiding anything. I just wasn't explaining. The consequences also began to touch areas he'd assumed were stable. Timelines changed. Options narrowed. Certain narratives no longer fit the available facts. Each development forced him to adjust, slightly, then more urgently. Still, he didn't confront me. That was telling. Deep down, I think he sensed that asking direct questions would invite answers he wasn't ready for. So he hovered instead, tentative, careful, watchful. I didn't exploit that. I maintained the same tone, the same routines, the same composure. Because the point wasn't to make him uncomfortable, it was to let accountability do its work without interference. There's a moment when consequences cross an invisible threshold, when they stop being abstract and start being felt. For him, it came quietly, a realization that something had shifted beyond his control, and that it hadn't happened overnight. It had been building. That realization didn't bring remorse. It brought confusion. How did this get so complicated? He asked one night, more to himself than to me. I didn't answer, because complexity doesn't appear suddenly. It accumulates, and what he was experiencing wasn't chaos. It was the natural outcome of choices that had finally encountered structure. From the outside, nothing looked explosive. Inside, the balance had already tipped. Consequences had begun, not as punishment, but as alignment. And alignment, once set in motion, doesn't reverse itself to preserve comfort. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, the window for fixing it had already closed. Not because I was unwilling to listen, not because I had become unkind, but because the conditions that once allowed repair, good faith, transparency, shared reality, no longer existed. The shift in him was subtle at first. He started asking questions that circled rather than landed, questions meant to test the ground, not understand it. Are you upset about something? Did I do something wrong? You know you can tell me if there's an issue, right? Each question arrived late, carefully worded, almost gentle. What struck me wasn't the concern, it was the timing. Concern, I learned, often appears when consequences become visible, not when harm is done. I answered neutrally. I'm fine. I don't have anything to add. We've talked about most things already. All true. Not comforting. That's when panic began to leak through the composure he'd maintained for years. Not loud panic, not desperation, restlessness. He began offering explanations no one had asked for, revisiting old conversations, reframing moments that had long passed. You know, when I said that before, I didn't mean it like that. I think we both misunderstood each other back then. I've been under a lot of pressure. These weren't confessions. They were attempts to renegotiate history. And history, once documented, doesn't renegotiate. What he didn't understand, what made it too late, was that repair requires symmetry. It requires two people operating from the same set of facts. We weren't. I wasn't withholding information to punish him. I wasn't playing a game. I had simply moved past the stage where explanations mattered more than outcomes. He sensed the distance and tried to close it with familiarity, sudden kindness, offers of help, nostalgia. Remember when things were easier? We've been through so much together. Those statements weren't wrong. They were irrelevant, because ease without honesty is just postponement. The more he tried to restore the old dynamic, the clearer it became that he didn't understand what had changed. He still believed the issue could be fixed with reassurance, that a reset was possible, that if he said the right thing or enough things, the situation would soften. What he didn't see was that the softness had already been replaced with structure, not cruelty, not rigidity, structure. I had crossed a line internally that can't be uncrossed. I no longer needed him to understand me for the truth to matter. That realization freed me from negotiation. The panic escalated when he realized external processes weren't bending. Deadlines arrived that couldn't be extended. Questions surfaced that couldn't be answered vaguely. Options narrowed. "What happens now?" he asked one night, finally direct. I met his eyes calmly. "We let things proceed," I said. "Not I will, not you should. We let things proceed." That sentence landed differently. Because it signaled something final, I wasn't reacting to him anymore. I was responding to reality. After that, the tone shifted again. Frustration, then confusion, then a quiet resentment that came from realizing control had already slipped away. He wanted to talk things out, to clear misunderstandings, to explain intentions. But intention without accountability is just a narrative, and narratives were no longer in charge. The truth is, it wasn't one moment that made it too late. It was the accumulation of moments when he could have chosen transparency and didn't. Moments when concern would have mattered if it had arrived earlier. Moments when repair was possible before preparation became necessary. By the time he wanted to fix it, I wasn't angry. I was finished, not with him as a person, but with the version of the relationship that required my silence to survive. That's the part people misunderstand about too late. It doesn't mean unforgivable. It means irreversible. Because once someone stops negotiating with reality, there's nothing left to fix, only consequences to move through. And those consequences were already in motion. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't look the way people imagine confrontation should. There was no raised voice, no dramatic reveal, no emotional release waiting years to explode. It took place in a quiet room, at a neutral time, with nothing pressing us to rush. That alone changed the balance. He had expected anger, or tears, or accusation, something he could respond to emotionally, something he could manage. What he didn't expect was stillness. "I need to understand what's happening," he said, sitting across from me, hands folded too carefully. "Because it feels like everything is falling apart and I don't know why." I let the silence sit for a moment, not to intimidate him, but to anchor myself in the facts. Then I spoke. "This isn't falling apart," I said calmly. "It's resolving." That word unsettled him. Resolving suggests an endpoint, not a crisis. He frowned. "Resolving what?" "The gap between what you've said and what's been happening," I replied, "and the consequences of that gap." He shifted in his seat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances. I didn't revisit old arguments. I didn't need to. I told him what I knew, briefly, factually, without embellishment. Dates, patterns, inconsistencies. Not all of them, just enough. I watched his expression change, not into rage or denial, but calculation. He was trying to determine how much I knew and how much room he had left to maneuver. That told me everything I needed to know. "You went through my things?" he asked finally. "No," I said. "I reviewed shared records." "There's a difference." And he knew it. He tried to explain, not aggressively, carefully. Context, stress, distance, miscommunication. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. "I didn't think it would go this far." "I know," I replied, "and I meant it. Intent doesn't erase impact, but acknowledging it prevents the conversation from turning theatrical. I didn't accuse him of being a bad person. I didn't demand an apology. Instead, I said something that ended the conversation more effectively than any argument could have. I'm not asking you to explain yourself, I said. I'm telling you what I'm no longer willing to absorb. That reframed everything. This wasn't about convincing me. This wasn't about defending himself. This was about limits. He tried once more to appeal to history, to shared effort, to the idea that we could still fix this privately. But private fixes rely on trust, and trust requires transparency long before discovery. I'm not interested in preserving appearances, I said. I'm interested in moving forward with integrity. There was no cruelty in my tone, no satisfaction, just clarity. The conversation ended quietly, not with agreement, but with understanding. He understood finally that this wasn't a negotiation, that the narrative control he'd relied on was gone, that the process ahead wouldn't be shaped by emotion. And I understood something too. I wasn't afraid of him anymore, not because he'd changed, but because I had. Confrontation without heat does something powerful. It removes the illusion that intensity equals control. There was nothing for him to push against, no reaction to provoke, no anger to redirect, no weakness to exploit, just boundaries, stated once. When we stood up to leave the room, he looked smaller, not diminished, but unarmored. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished with the conversation that had been playing in my head for years. That was enough. Because accountability doesn't require punishment. It requires the end of accommodation. And that end, once spoken aloud, cannot be taken back. Who I am now is quieter than who I was before, but not in the same way. Before, my quiet was a convenience, something others benefited from, something that smoothed edges and absorbed discomfort, so the system could keep running unchanged. Now my quiet belongs to me. It's not a lack of voice. It's the absence of need to explain myself to people who aren't listening. The aftermath didn't transform me into someone hardened or bitter. If anything, it clarified what had always been there but underused. I am more selective with my energy, more precise with my words, less interested in being understood by everyone, and more committed to being aligned with myself. I don't rush to fill the silence anymore. I don't correct every misinterpretation. I don't overfunction to prevent other people's discomfort. That doesn't mean I've withdrawn from life. It means I've stepped into it differently. I show up fully where accountability exists, where effort moves both ways, where truth isn't something that has to be negotiated. In other spaces I observe, that balance has changed how people interact with me. Some mistake it for distance, some for confidence, some for coldness. I don't correct them because who I am now doesn't depend on external validation. I'm no longer interested in roles that require self-erasure to maintain harmony. If something needs my participation, it will need my consent. If something needs my silence, it will not get it automatically. That shift didn't make me louder. It made it clearer. As a mother, this clarity matters most. My child doesn't see a woman who absorbs blame quietly anymore. They see someone who moves deliberately, who doesn't panic under pressure, who doesn't explain away misalignment. They see that boundaries don't require anger, and that calm can coexist with firmness. That's the example I wanted to set all along, even when I didn't know how. I'm still empathetic, still thoughtful, still capable of patience. But patience now has an endpoint. I no longer confuse endurance with virtue. The version of me that tried to be endlessly reasonable is gone, not because she was wrong, but because she was exhausted. In her place is someone more honest, someone who understands that accountability isn't something you demand from others. It's something you model by refusing to carry what isn't yours. I don't feel the need to rewrite the past. I understand it now. I see how the roles formed, how silence was rewarded, how consistency was mistaken for compliance. I also see how easily that could have continued if I hadn't stopped. That awareness doesn't make me resentful. It makes me intentional. Who I am now is someone who trusts herself without needing confirmation. Someone who understands that dignity doesn't announce itself. It holds its ground. And perhaps most importantly, someone who knows that quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about control over what you allow to shape your life. That's who I am now. Not louder, not colder. Just no longer available for narratives that require my disappearance to make sense. If there's one thing this story taught me, it's that accountability doesn't arrive the way we expect it to. It doesn't always come with apologies. It doesn't always come with understanding. And it rarely comes from the person who avoided it the longest. More often, accountability arrives as a consequence, quiet, procedural, unavoidable. For a long time, I believed that being reasonable would protect me, that if I stayed calm, fair, and patient, the truth would eventually surface on its own and be enough. What I learned instead is that truth needs structure to survive. Without boundaries, it gets edited. Without records, it gets reframed. Without consequences, it gets ignored. This isn't a story about punishment. It's a story about alignment, about what happens when you stop absorbing blame that doesn't belong to you, when you stop negotiating your reality to preserve someone else's comfort, when you realize that silence can either erase you or protect you, depending on how you use it. My husband tried to blame me for his affair during the custody hearing. He spoke confidently, calmly, as if reframing responsibility were just another version of honesty. But by then, accountability had already arrived. Not because I exposed him emotionally, but because I prepared factually. Not because I demanded fairness, but because I refused to distort myself to maintain imbalance. The consequences didn't humiliate him. They clarified the truth, and clarity, once established, doesn't need drama to hold its ground. I didn't win. I stood still while reality caught up. There's a difference. If you're listening to this and seeing yourself in parts of it, not the betrayal, but the quiet endurance, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't have to be louder to be powerful. You don't have to be cruel to be firm. You don't have to explain yourself endlessly for the truth to matter. Sometimes the most decisive moment is the one where you stop reacting and start choosing. This story isn't an instruction manual. It's a reminder. That calm doesn't mean compliant. That patience doesn't mean permission. And that accountability, when it arrives with consequences, doesn't ask for agreement. It simply takes effect. Before I end this, I want to ask you something, not to provoke, but to open a conversation. Have you ever reached a moment where you realized you didn't need to convince anyone anymore because your clarity was already enough? If you have, I'd like to hear about it.
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.